what the product team began to note is that there was at least some portion of the users that were uploading that one photo picture 20 times a day or something like that, lots and lots a day because they wanted to share photos with their friends.
Hi, Justin. Thank you so much for coming onto the pod today.
Thank you so much for having me, Grace. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so to start the show, I want to give the audience a little bit of background of yours. So you were originally from New Orleans and you family are working in the psychology industry and you are a great leader today. So I want to get to know you a little bit more about how you grew up and how you kind of get to where you are from your own perspective.
Sure, that sounds fun. So I did. I grew up in New Orleans. I'm the son of a psychiatrist and a psychologist and a middle child. So you can only imagine what our family dinners were like growing up. But I grew up in New Orleans, which is still deep within me. Love being back home, getting an oyster po' boy. I then spent a bit over a decade out in Boston, where I went to school. I met Alicia, now my wife, and had a really great experience rooting for the Red Sox and exchanging my oyster po' boys for lobster rolls. Then Alicia, my wife's a prosecutor.
Mhm.
So she was actually at a large law firm in Boston while I was in consulting and applied for clerkships. She ended up getting a clerkship in San Francisco. So we moved
Mhm.
out to San Francisco. That's how I ended here about 13 years ago. And I've now been at Instagram for a bit over 2 years and at Facebook for 13 years.
I don't want to be creepy, but since you work for Instagram, so I yesterday I stalked your Instagram for the news, right? Beside amazing food pictures, I also saw you congratulated on your sibling, your sister specifically, and she seems like really successful in her career as well. So I'm just curious, like what kind of education did you get from your parents or like the environment that you were growing up to kind of motivate you to become super driven and obviously extremely successful today?
Yeah, so my sister Hari, so I've got an older sister Hari and a younger brother Michael. My parents both strongly believed in education, and we had the privilege of getting great educations. Michael now lives in Hong Kong, where he
Mhm.
actually has a PhD in psychology, and Hari went more of a legal path, and
Mhm.
recently became the dean of Northwestern Pritzker School of Law. Really proud of them. But yeah, no, education has definitely been a theme. I'm in some ways one more of a business route than academia.
You're really successful in business today. And who do you kind of consult your career decisions with?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because I think you need a mix of folks that you look to mentorship and advice for,
Mhm.
or from that. Some of them need to have context on what you're doing. So as I'm making career decisions, there'll be people that work for Facebook I talk to. There are people that used to work for Facebook or kind of went to school with over the years. But one of the most important people I actually chat with are my siblings.
Mhm.
Because while, for instance, Hari isn't from the world of business, she actually has really interesting perspectives because she knows me. And I
Mhm.
think whenever you're making these kind of important decisions, there's always this introspective lens. And so I think having a mix of perspectives, some from like kind of the world so they understand what it means to work at Instagram and be COO, but
Mhm.
others who just understand Justin. And this is, I know
Mhm.
you from growing up, are a really nice mix.
Very interesting. I totally agree with you on knowing yourself and knowing your strengths is like extremely important. So speaking of like getting advice from people who knows you, what do you think is your superpower? Like for example, like I feel like to succeed in business from my observations from like chatting with super successful people, I think each person really leverage their own inner strength. Like at what point do you realize what's your strengths and like what is your superpower?
So I think some quote superpowers you're probably born with, and others you develop over time. Like I'm not a
Mm,
great athlete, but if I were a great athlete, I guess I would have been born as a great athlete and then worked to become a better one.
mhm,
But one that I think I've developed over time, and this does relate probably to the way I grew up, is the ability to put myself in someone else's shoes
mm,
and understand how they're going to perceive a situation. So I feel like I can walk into rooms and take a topic And with 80 to 90% accuracy, I can pretty much know how this person's going to react and that person's going to react, which gives me the ability before you walk in the room to
Mhm,
kind of mediate the conversation after to follow up on stuff. And then I
mhm,
also think there's an aspect where I've increasingly grown aware of my own weaknesses. So I often am put into
mhm.
roles where I think the most important thing I can do in the role is to find people better than me, to hire them, to empower them, to make them successful. But if you look at the roles I've had over the years, running media partnerships for Facebook, I was really proud to hire people who had more depth in lots of areas of partnerships than I did, and certainly running operations as well. And I try to do the same thing at Instagram.
So speaking of like the hiring part, what are some ways to improve your ability to resonate with people? I feel like that just speaks into your EQ. I feel like this is something that you definitely develop after you're born, assuming. I think like maybe growing up in a psychology family does help you to get a sense of like what people are thinking. As a regular person, how can we pick up the EQ side of things? And you're obviously young compared to a lot of people who achieve to a similar position in other companies. And I'm curious, like, how do you kind of accelerate those kind of emotional intelligence growth? Is there something specifically that you do? For example, reading a certain type of books, or like, is there any specific experience that you had that you feel like kind of shaped you into the way that you are thinking now?
I think you certainly can, and I do read thoughtful books and kind of get perspectives there. But a lot of it is, I think, listening and observing those around you and taking the things they do really well and things
Mm,
that you'd want to do differently. Like, so when I worked in consulting, which is now well over a decade ago, my biggest takeaways a decade later were not like a late night in a team room making a deck, but it was after you did that. So let's say you made 100-page deck diving deep into an issue that was supposed to be the focus of the meeting for the client. And I
mhm,
remember being kind of the junior person on the team, walking in with a partner, the senior person. You're walking to the office of a C-level executive or CEO.
mhm,
You have this 100-page PowerPoint document that you think you're about to walk through. And actually, what I found in a lot of those meetings, the partner would put down the document and not even refer to it and ask the
mm,
person how they're doing. And what you actually hear in those conversations is it was called releasing the agenda, because what's top of mind for that person, what was not your deck, it was that there was an HR issue or that there was a business thing that erupted, and connecting with people and putting your in your shoes was one of the things I learned there. Then I think you
mm,
can just apply it in different contexts. The other concept, by the way, in consulting that was really powerful for me was this notion of followership, which
mhm,
is to make partner at the firm. Part of the criteria was that people had to want to work for you again. And one of the things that I look for both on my teams and hopefully in myself is I look to have leaders on the team that people really want to work for, because I think it tells you you're doing something right. You're investing in them and you're helping them grow their own careers.
what are some characteristics that's like make people want to work for you?
I think listening, and then I think solving problems for them. Like a lot of folks would think as you step into senior leadership roles, there's a perfect 100-day plan and a strategy and all the things you do.
Mhm,
I actually tend to take a somewhat different approach, which is I begin by listening. So when I became COO of Instagram, the first thing I basically did was set up dozens of one-on-ones with people
mhm,
all through the organization, from leaders of engineering to sales to our EAs to people who worked in California to people who worked in London and in Singapore. And those conversations were pretty simple. I would just say, what's going well, what's not, what would you like me to do to help, and where would you like me to stay out of the way? And in the 30 minutes, the first 23 minutes of the conversation are getting to know each other. And then the last 7 minutes, you tend to hear a little nugget of something that could go better. And then the question is what you do about it. So, like, actually, one of the first things I did at Instagram was in talking with our engineers, heard that we lived in this, or we work in this large office building with like
mhm,
38 floors in San Francisco.
mhm.
And at dinner time, the staircases were closed. But if you could get the staircases open another couple hours, it would make the lives of engineers a lot better. And so, called up facilities and they were nice enough to accommodate that. And all of a sudden, like the engineers kind of walked by and were like, that's cool. And it reminded me, I'm not sure if you've seen the show Ted Lasso.
I think I Googled it before I came on, but no, I haven't
Yeah, so
yet.
there's this great thing in the first season of Ted Lasso where he's
Mhm,
stepping in as a soccer coach. and a sport he doesn't know.
Mhm.
And one of the first things he does is some players felt the shower pressure in the showers was not as good as should be. And they
Mhm.
walked in one day and that was fixed. I actually believe solving problems for people gives you the credibility and also showing that you're really human. Like another thing that bothered
Mm.
me in our San Francisco office is when you have so many floors, it was hard to run into people. So
Mm.
what I started doing is hosting office hours in the elevator. And then it was a little weird at first, but then I started bringing a dim sum card. So people would go into the elevator and have some like hargao and some vegetarian dumplings, and then occasionally walk out on the floor and hand things out. And all of a sudden, you spend 3 minutes to 4 minutes with folks, and you begin to build real relationships, which I think lay the foundation to do productive work together.
Yeah, heard about that story in your other podcast interview. And then you also mentioned like, you created this like every Friday, you guys will have like a frozen lemon situation. So basically it's like the way that you're like connecting with people on your team to actually make them talk about the challenges that they're facing, or like some basically like fire burning situation that they're able to see, but maybe high level could. I think those are really admirable. And I think my curiosity is I heard the really resonating chat with like the former CEO of Chipotle. He said the same thing. He talked to 20K people who are running Chipotle stores. I'm like, A, how are you able to chat with that many people? And like, and I feel like those really resonate with me. So do you have like some assumptions on what's going on in the company, and then you're trying to validating your assumption by chatting with people, or do you chat with people first and then solve their problem? Another of my curiosity is like, typically as a COO, as a C-level executive, I assume you have to maybe report to your CEO or your board member or like some other people you have to report it to. How do you kind of create those KPIs? If you spend a lot of time chatting with people, maybe those KPI shifts. Yeah, like I'm just curious, like how do you kind of like shape your own job in that sense?
Yeah, I think it's a very sensitive question. And I think in any leadership role, there are goals and metrics you agree on that are kind of hard goals and metrics on things you think are important to deliver. And they can be, things like revenue, growth, success of projects, like for instance, for us, Reels or commerce. There also, I think, in leadership are a softer set of metrics that are equally important to align on. One is that I think every leader should be developing good successors and a good bench. And I think thinking about what that means and how you do it and how you grow people to be able to take your role, because I probably had about 10 different jobs over 13 years at Facebook. And I
Mhm.
think one of the important things is there has to be someone who's very capable of doing that job. The other thing, and this goes a little less to metrics, but a little more about leading an organization, is
Mm.
how do you understand your own blind spots? So, to the
Mhm.
framing of your question on do you have hypotheses going into conversations? Absolutely. But one of my core hypotheses is I do not understand the day to day realities of a job that I'm not yet doing. So,
Mhm.
for instance, if I'm talking to someone who's based in London,
Mhm.
working with partners or creators, I know what they're going through day to day is different than probably my perception of it. And so I've
Mhm.
got to understand, which I guess brings us to the frozen lemon a
Mhm.
concept.
Mhm.
So just the brief story there is after we had our first daughter, I
Mhm.
walked into my house one day and in the front hall
Mhm.
saw this huge green bag that I didn't order and Alicia had ordered from a grocery delivery
Mhm.
service. And I opened the green bag and there was this big styrofoam cooler. And I opened the styrofoam cooler and dug to the bottom. And all of a sudden, my hands are cold and wet. And I have no idea what's going on until at the bottom, I pick up two frozen lemons. So I'm sitting and looking at these lemons. I'm holding them. First of all, reflecting like, who wants a frozen lemon? Like maybe if you're making an adult beverage or something, most lemons shouldn't be frozen. But then I actually came to the realization that probably 10 people at the company had worked on my order, and
Mhm.
all of them had done their job to the letter of the policies. That if you're ordering a perishable good like a lemon, you pack it in ice, and then you put that ice in a cooler, and then you put it in a green bag, etc. And my guess is most of the people doing this thought what they were doing was crazy. It
Mhm.
made no sense, but it was the rules, and so you follow the rules. And one of my big concerns when you run a large organization is
Mhm.
the people that actually see what's wrong also
Mhm.
need to be empowered to change the rules themselves.
Mhm.
So the spirit of the Frozen Lemon Awards, the reason we talk about frozen lemons is I want people in my organization, when they see something wrong, to feel empowered to go, Justin, this is crazy, change it. And I think that's really important when you're running large organizations.
I totally agree with you, and I see where you're coming from. So a lot of the rules are created by people who have done this before, but on the other hand, because of the fast speed of like a company has to grow, so like a lot of things has already changed, and then you have to adapt the change in your management style before getting stuck in some situation that shouldn't be stuck on. I think it is a really great strategy to constantly changing, I wouldn't say the rules, but like constantly adapting yourself into a fast changing environment. So I think one of the questions I always have, what exactly is the differences between a CEO and a COO? Because I understand from like the word perspective, the CEO is like more in charge of like everything. But I feel like the CEO, since the COO's job is like helping the company run smoothly, helping the operation side of things grow. What's your definition of like you're doing a good job at your job?
I think there's many dimensions to that question.
Mhm.
The first is uh, I think an effective CEO and COO have a close partnership together.
Mm,
That you really need alignment at a leadership level on what are the most important things for an organization at any given time, and then how do you
mhm,
best do it. Typically, you then see a split in the roles that
mhm,
obviously everything reports into the CEO, including the COO, but
mhm,
also you might see different functions that report directly. So, for instance, Adam Mosseri is the head of Instagram,
mhm,
and the technical functions report to Adam directly. They don't report to me. So,
mhm,
it's engineering and kind of product management and design, et cetera,
mhm,
where the business functions
mhm,
within the broader Facebook company in
mhm,
a somewhat matrixed way report to me. But then the question is, how do you ensure that the business functions are supporting the overall strategy?
mhm,
And importantly, how do you ensure that the execution is not siloed within functions? So,
mhm,
we have great people working on our communications team, on our
mhm,
marketing team, on
mhm,
partnerships, on operations, on policy, on
mhm,
finance, on HR, et cetera. But the best execution that we do is execution that cuts across. And what's interesting when you need to cut across, say, partnerships, communications, and marketing, you often need kind of an independent lens on what it means to execute well within those teams and then how they
mhm,
amplify the efforts of each other. So when we're putting our best foot forward to creators in the world, you want our partnerships team out engaging with creators and helping them achieve their goals. You want our
mhm,
communications team to be telling the stories. You want a marketing team to be amplifying it and
mhm,
to be telling the story of Instagram and creators.
mhm,
Those teams have to work together. And so I think a big part of the role of a COO is
mhm.
to ensure that you have good execution across.
That makes a lot of sense. Like I think you also mentioned in the other interview, you're saying like one of your core function of your job is to make sure team A and knows the prioritization of team B. So basically becoming the bridge between like different groups of people. And I'm curious, like, how do you prioritize these groups? Should I prioritize product first or like HR first or like finance first? Like, what should be a company prioritize?
Yeah. So first of all, I do think reaching a work-life integration or balance matters. For me, it's slightly more than 5 days a week and slightly more than 8 hours a day, but that's fine. I mean, I actually think
Mhm,
prioritization differs based on the problem that you're trying to solve and the
mhm,
nature of your organization. So,
mhm,
I mean, if you think about it in classic, in a lot of Silicon Valley companies, these are product and tech led. You often have a
mhm,
founder who's driving product strategy, and then you're figuring out how the business functions help effectuate product
mhm,
strategy. You can have companies in very different industries, though. If you're talking
mhm,
about a consumer packaged good company, or a company deep in the brand, or one of these iconic brands in the world, you might have a very different role that marketing plays. Or,
mhm,
if you think about beautiful phones you hold, I assure you the design teams are very
mhm,
important there. You're constantly making resource trade-offs. And I think of like a couple of things that Mark has said over the years, Mark Zuckerberg. One is that every organization chart kind of sucks. You get to choose how your organization sucks. And so I think being intentional about the ways in which
mhm,
how things work together, whether you organize functionally or you
mhm,
organize by business unit. The second thing is as I think about allocating resources, I often am looking at kind of a couple of different dimensions. One
Mm,
is how important is the initiative to our overall strategy? And some things are more important than others at different moments of time. And then, by the way, how much confidence you have the team in place that can execute against what you're allocating to? Because from time to time, you wouldn't want to make a major investment if you don't yet have a high functioning team. The flip side is, yeah, a high functioning team might be time to really put a little gas behind it and
mhm.
make more of an investment to accelerate your progress. But I think this lens of kind of considering both the strategic importance, but also the health of your organization, the health of the team matters a lot.
Mm. I'm taking those. So one part is like identify what your company is doing. Like I think different company probably have different priorities. Like for example, for tech company, it could be product, it could be tech. And second is like balance the strategic team as well as like the health of your organization. I never heard of the word like the health of your organization, but I feel like it's definitely really important to make sure people are functioning with each other than having conflicts, and then as well as like even they're not really working on the core product, but without them the product probably wouldn't be able to function. I feel like that's super
Yeah,
interesting.
strategy and execution, they go hand in hand. You can
Hmm.
have the best strategy in the world, but if you can't execute it, it's a PowerPoint deck. On the flip side, you can
Hmm.
have the best execution in the world, but if you set the wrong goal, you're executing towards the wrong thing. One of the things I've found about teams is
Hmm.
good teams hit the goals. And the biggest mistake that I can make is setting the wrong goal because we'll actually hit that, but that may actually lead to the wrong outcome. And so I think
Hmm.
the notion of strategy and execution, you can't decouple it. They have to go together.
How do you come up with a strategy then? Like I think as a leader you have to set a goal for the team to hit, right? Like so I guess two part of the question. One part is how like do you test out your strategy before you launch it to the whole company? So for me as a startup founder myself, as mentioned in like our previous like the little email thing I sent, is like I feel like it's really challenging to set a goal because as a startup you're changing every day. So last week it could be like we're still working on the creator economy. This week we're working on NFTs. Like everything is changing all the time. So the strategy may not be fully executed from last week. This week we're doing something very different. And for a big company, I guess it's really challenging if you're shifting your goals all the time. How do you kind of identify what's the best thing to do at the moment, and how do you kind of test it out before you launch it to, you know, like a giant team at Instagram?
So I think there's a couple of different ways that you can develop strategy.
Hmm.
One is by observing kind of behavior and then
Hmm.
trying to make it better. One of my favorite examples is when Facebook launched, there
Hmm.
was basically no way to upload a photo. There was this
Hmm.
one place you could put a photo on your profile. And
Hmm.
what the product team began to note is that there was at least some portion of the users that were uploading that one photo picture 20 times a day or something like that, lots and lots a day because they wanted to share photos with their friends. And so then Facebook launched a photos product, seeing this kind of latent consumer demand for the behavior. And it
Mm,
turned out, obviously, into one of the more important features of kind of what made Facebook special and connecting with other
mhm,
people.
mhm,
The other way to develop a strategy, and I think by the way both work, is that you can look at something going on in the world that you think is screwed up and you can do better. Like one example from
mhm,
outside of my company is there's a remarkable company founded down in Sao Paulo called Nubank.
mm,
And the founder David, the reason he went after the opportunities, he tried to essentially open a banking account in Brazil, and he found the process really, really hard on lots of dimensions. And he just
mhm,
said this could be better for people. And
mm,
so that was the spark that gave the inspiration that eventually turned into Nubank, which now is, I think, one of the most important financial companies or fintech companies in Latin America and arguably
mm,
globally. But I think either way is a way to get to strategy. And then to your point, it's testing something out. In the former example, you're not testing anything out. You know the behavior is there. It's can you do it well enough to allow it to scale? In the latter example, you would probably do iterative product development and you begin with one product and see does it work and what did you learn and what did you not, and take it from there.
mm. For sure. I'm curious, like, what is the best way to figure out like if this particular product is for you? like there's so many options. Like Instagram could go into so many directions, right? Like right now, Instagram's product, including IGTV and as well as like a lot of other like Instagram shopping and like a lot of different functions on Instagram. But there's also other ways, right? Like for example, pivoting into like a photo news channel. Company could be executing a plan into a very different ways. How do you guys identify what is the thing that you should be doing?
Well, there's a few ways you do it. The first is we've got three product values at Instagram:
Mm,
people first, craft, and simplicity. And it's easy to put
mhm,
posters on the wall that say
mhm,
those things. But I remember walking into my first product review where I was just listening.
mhm,
And we were at the time discussing a test on whether or not you hide like counts and one flavor of the test.
mhm,
And the discussion for the first 20 minutes
mhm,
wasn't looking at any metrics around. It was, is this people first? Is this simple? Is this
mhm,
reflective of the craft that we want? And so I think living those values is one way that you make trade-offs. A second
mhm,
thing that I enjoy doing is not only having goals for an organization, but
mhm,
explicitly having non-goals. That you need to
mhm,
know at a given moment what you're focused on, but also what you're not. So for instance, one example historically with Facebook is for many years, there were
mhm,
questions, would we roll out an ad network? And we would make a non-goal for until we eventually did, but a non-goal through several cycles, no. That we
mhm,
think there's more important things to do for our ads business than roll out this ad network. And so we take it off the table. And
mhm,
the final thing that I'm proud to do at Instagram is we unship products. So
mhm,
in the spirit of keeping things simple, every several months we go through a process where we look at what have we shipped that we want to take away, that it's not
mhm,
going as well as we thought. But you
mhm,
can't keep something simple if you're always adding incrementally to it. So I
mhm,
think for different organizations, it'll be different things because different
mhm.
organizations will have different values. But I think it begins with values, and then it's how do you implement the values.
For sure. I piggyback on like executing a plan, right? So I think as you mentioned, like A, identify the strategy, and B is like executing on that strategy. I think as a COO, a large part of your job is to probably motivating people, selecting people to work with. And then as you mentioned, you previously hired some really high profile um people from other industries or like other experts on your team that coding what you said in another interview is like they're probably better than you in some different sectors. And how do you kind of convince them to join you, as they probably also have other options? A, like how do you hire them? And then B, how do you kind of keep them? Because I think from my brief, like managing my interns, I guess like they don't want to be managed. And then like a lot of times, like I wouldn't be able to know what they want. And then the other part is like I'm desperate to be their friend. I want to be likable. I want to invest in their career. I introduce other people that may able to help them. But on the other hand, like if they didn't really meet a deadline or something, besides like I like politely poking them on it, but I wouldn't know how to be their boss as well as be their friend. How do you balance out these kind of relationships?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of texture to that question. The first is how do you get someone to join an organization? And I found there's for most people a couple dimensions that really matter. One is
Mhm,
people want to work for something they believe in, that
mhm,
is making a difference in the world, that is consistent with their values. So like if you join
mhm,
Instagram, you're joining because you believe in the mission of the company. You use the app. You think it's
mhm,
great, and you see what more it could become. It's not just what it
mhm,
is today, but what would it mean to like
mhm,
kind of take Instagram into the future. The
mhm,
second thing that kind of gets people to join is the people. And obviously, if it's an intern relationship, it's a person. But I actually think when you go through recruiting at a larger company, meeting and getting to know who you're going to work with, and often, particularly when you're making senior hires,
mhm,
it's not the fastest process. You're often building relationships with people, both externally and internally, over
mhm,
several months to several years,
mhm,
and waiting for the right thing to emerge. Then the second part of your question is, okay, so the person's hired. How do you keep them? And I think it's empowering, but helping them move towards their goals.
Mm,
One thing that like Sheryl Sandberg's framework and kind of thinking about career is you look at your career in two time horizons.
mhm,
One is say in a call it 18 months, but a near term horizon. Are you learning? Are you growing? Are you excited? Are you working for a manager that you think is helping
mhm,
develop you, including giving constructive feedback? Like you
mhm,
missed that deadline. That can't happen.
mhm,
Like let's figure it out. But the second time horizon is longer term. Call a decade
mhm,
out. It could be 8 years, 5 years, etc. But if you
mhm,
think about where your career wants to go, is this role directionally going towards that? Nothing is totally linear, but directionally in that. And if both are lining up, you're likely to stay in a role, particularly if you're working for someone who you believe in and think you're learning from. And if they aren't, you're going to leave the role.
mhm,
And you probably should leave the role. So
mhm,
one of the things then that I think is incumbent upon someone hiring is
mhm,
understanding both about a person. Like I often am having career conversations with people, which is where do you want to be a decade out? Because different people answer that question differently. For some, it might be
mhm,
going exceptionally deep on a given issue and never managing, but like as an individual contributor, becoming a real expert on something they care deeply about. And for others, they want to be a COO, they want to be a CEO, they want to manage a big organization. And then,
mhm,
well, for the former, you wouldn't worry about kind of putting them up a people management learning curve. For the latter, you better figure out ways to put them up a people management learning curve so they feel like they're going
mhm,
towards where their career is headed. But the answer for each of us is an introspective answer. And
mhm.
so getting to that point of introspection and then mapping it to what the person wants means you get to unique answers for everyone.
I think that's like a really I really like your answers. It's all like kind of like philosophical. It's like very high level, but also like I do think they're like applying into it could be applying into like your day-to-day job as like a great thinking framework in terms of like managing these like I guess like executing these kind of goals. Like how do you walk it into your conversation? You probably manage like a bazillion people. How do you kind of prioritize everybody's goal as well as like meeting a team goal? Like how do you set up like a team KPI and how do you motivate each person? I guess like listening to get the answers for their 18 months goal or like 10-year goal, right? But like I think people don't typically talk about it. Like if I were in an interview, I would say whatever I feel like can make me stay. Or like how do you actually listen to them? And number two is like people have different priorities. Each person's like motivated by different things. Like every single day, how do you keep on track? Like this is similar to assuming you and I walking into a bar where like we're bartenders and then like you're serving different drinks to a different person. And then how do you kind of like keep everybody on a track? Like do you use like Excel sheets? I know I sounds like so naive, but like I'm just curious, like how do you manage to memorize these kind of things.
There's first the question of like how do you understand what people's needs are, both when they join your organization, but also when they're in your organization. And I
Mhm,
think the only way to do it is have direct conversations, because the reality is people's needs also change over time. Their desires
mhm,
change over time. You've had one career experience that makes you think, I want to try podcasting, or
mhm,
things happen in career over the course of a journey, and
yeah,
you need to be temperature checking and
mhm,
consistently like moving on that journey with a person. Then
mm,
there's a part which is how do you get teams? How do you ensure that an individual's aspirations map to what you need to accomplish? There, I'm very strengths based. I think different people have different strengths. And when you put someone in a role where their strengths map to the goal that you're trying to achieve, and ideally you have a diversity of strengths on a team, so you actually have cohesion and you have different things going on, that's when you get the best execution. And by the way, typically you hit a moment of equilibrium where you think everything's great and then something changes. One person leaves the team or the goals shift a little bit or someone burns out or, something like that. And you always have to be adapting to that reality. But I think one lesson I heard, I think it was from John Donahoe when he was at Bain, was he believed in the notion of something called repotting, which is every kind of 2 or 3 years to take a person and to view them as part of a garden, but to pick them up and put them in a different part of the garden to try to move them up a kind of a new learning curve. And when I look at my career, I've played a bunch of different roles, some
mm,
of which I liked more, some of which I liked a little less, but collectively they then create judgment. Because the hardest thing to do in an organization, I think, is to
Mhm.
scale the judgment of the leaders of an organization. And to your point on how do you manage all this, I can't, for running a multi-thousand person ops organization, have a perfect Excel sheet that reflects what everyone wants. But I can invest in really good managers, in the training to make them good managers, and the
Mhm.
tools and skill sets, in HR processes that are hopefully lightweight, but that also encourage people to have real conversations, that encourage real-time feedback to improve performance and to invest. And if you do that right, that is, in a sense, your metaphorical spreadsheet, because you have
Mhm.
each person working for a manager that gets them, that's investing in them, that cares about them. And then as an
Mhm.
organization a whole, you have a high functioning organization.
Totally. So I guess like what is the training like for your managers? Like what are something that you look for when you're hiring people who directly work for you? Are they great? Like, do you test their listening skill? Do you test their sales skill? Like, what are some couple skills that you feel like they should be constantly getting better at?
So there's some stuff that'll be role specific. So say when I ran media partnerships and I wanted to hire
Mhm.
a head of entertainment, we hired Sybil Goldman, who is Ryan
Mhm.
Seacrest's right-hand woman, terrific, but she
Mhm.
knows the world of entertainment really well. And that was really important to the role. But then some things cut across great leaders. I do think this notion of followership matters. So one of the things I like to do when I hire people, particularly at a senior level, is try to get a 360 perspective on them. So I don't just want to know, their former manager. What did you think of this person? Were they good or not? I'd love to talk to some peers that worked with them,
Mhm.
and were they collaborative? Did they work well cross-functionally? I'd also have talked to a couple people who worked on their team. Were they good managers?
Mhm.
And I think by getting that kind of 360 perspective, you get a holistic. And by the way, you don't have to be perfect on every dimension, but it does say where your strengths are and where you may need to work. And you'll find the best leaders, I think, have people that want to continue working for them. They have people that trust them to get things done. So you don't need a micromanager person. You just know this person's going to run with it. And then
Mhm.
they build very collaborative relationships with key adjacent people, because that's how organizations run really well.
Yeah, totally. Like when it comes to measuring these things, like I guess like you mentioned like being collaborative, being able to like you evaluate it, be set like their boss, you ask their boss, you probably ask like people they who worked for them as well as like their peers. I think those are all like great like ways to executing on it. Some people could be great in one environment. When you shift them to a different environment, it could be really different, right? Like for example, for the Ryan Secret right hand women, assuming they were working in a traditional media space, and when they come into Facebook, it's a different culture. How do you make sure that they could be a good fit for people in your team?
Yeah. So I think you have to have a sense of your organization, what makes people successful, because every organization is different.
Mhm.
But at Facebook, I think the most successful people we have,
Mhm.
they are able to go deep on product because our product matters so much. They
Mhm.
are collaborative. They know how to build trusting relationships and
Mhm.
also how to escalate issues, because there's from time to time you have to escalate and frame things well
Mhm.
and then kind of run. But I think for every organization, it's probably different in terms of what makes successful. So you need to reflect on yours.
Like I have a 1 minute fire round for you. Is it
Sure.
okay? Wait,
Let's
thank
do
you.
it.
Okay, so the first question, what's your favorite book?
Um, well, I'm reading a lot of kids' books right now, so it would probably be Goodnight Construction Site or maybe something from the Madeline series.
Okay, so who would you invite to your dinner party?
Oh, that's a fun one. Um, so I probably would want a mix of people at the dinner parties. So I could imagine like people that could go deep on issues. So for instance, I think like Anthony Fauci would be fascinating to have dinner with right now, or Bob Wachter, to understand the state of the world. You might want people who've gone deep in their fields in a way that you never kind of did. Like I think great chefs, not only maybe making amazing food, but Matt Horn, who does amazing barbecue in Oakland, to understand the journey he's been on to understand. Those are the type of people I want to have around the table.
Um, where can we find you outside of work?
Outside of work, you can find me on playgrounds a lot. You can find me finding local unknown restaurants. I always have this mental list of places I want to check out. So like, whether it's Balampi, this place on 18th Street in San Francisco that's supposed to have amazing pupusas, or Matterhorn's barbecue place in Oakland, or a place in Richmond that has kind of really interesting dim sum. That's where you can find me.
Who made the biggest impact in your career?
I've had so many people that have made really meaningful impacts in my career, ranging from a partner I worked with at McKinsey, Leo Grapen. I learned so much from Leo, obviously at Facebook. Sheryl Sandberg's been very meaningful. Adam Mosseri, who I work for at Instagram, and folks like Dan Rose and Ethan Beard. I find in each role you have, you learn a lot from people, and I'm just very grateful to all of those folks.
Last question. Who is your business crush? AKA, like, who do you modeling yourself off? Or who do you think it's like the one business person that you feel like it's really great?
So I guess this implicitly means to take a company outside of Facebook, because I think that's probably the spirit of the business. I'm not sure I have a single business crush. There's lots of companies I admire for different reasons. I think a company like Nike, and they've also had very different leaders over the years, just the craft it takes to both develop a kind of a marketing message that resonates and a product that people care deeply about is like one dimension. But on the flip side, I actually think when you look at a great manufacturing company, it's remarkable. Like classically Toyota, and the way in which they worked on the manufacturing line as person in ops, I have such deep respect. So I can't pick one, because I think there's different parts of me that I admire different companies for.
Yeah, that's a great answer. It's not even a person, it's two companies. But thank you so much, Justin, for coming on to the show.
Thank you so much for having me and for this important series that you're doing. I think these conversations are really great.
Thank you so much.